What if the United States never used nuclear bombs against Japan? This question has been on my mind ever since I went and saw Oppenheimer, which is incredible by the way, you really should watch it. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan in hopes of forcing the island empire to surrender. Up until that point, it was unclear when World War II may come to a close, as the Japanese weren't showing many signs of giving up the fight. The use of nuclear bombs by the US military changed that. After the bombs killed an estimated 129,000 to 226,000 people, most of whom were innocent civilians, Japan officially surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, bringing World War II to a close. To this day, it remains the only time nuclear weapons have ever been used against another country. The debate around whether or not the United States should have used these bombs is never ending, but that's not necessarily what we're discussing today. The United States changed the course of the world forever when those bombs were dropped. But what if it hadn't used them? Not only would the world as a whole be way different today, but World War II could have dragged on for much, much longer. To further understand that, though, we need to know more about what led up to the bombs being dropped. Let's jump into it. During the first 2 years of World War II, from 1939 to 1941, the United States remained out of the war for the most part, watching from the sidelines as Hitler blitzkrieged through Europe and Japan decimated East Asia. I say for the most part because President Roosevelt did help contribute to the war effort prior to officially joining. No soldiers were fighting though. That all changed on December 7th, 1941, when a surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii pulled the United States out of isolationism and into war. One day later, Congress declared war on Japan with only one member voting no. I'd like to stop now and say briefly that while this section is called the basics of World War II, there's no such thing as the basics. It's a bad title, I'm kind of an idiot, and there's too much history that exists for there to be just basics. With that being said, I'm going to do my best to fill you in on how the US got involved, as we'll need to know that for later. Let's get back into it. So on December 8th, 1941, the US officially entered the war. However, they're still only fighting Japan in the Pacific. How did they get involved in Europe? Well, a few days later, that silly little man with that silly little mustache in Nazi Germany declared war on the United States, dragging America into the European theater as well. Does that all make sense? I hope so. As the war raged on and many key battles were fought, the Allied powers, that's the US, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and many other European countries, closed in on Nazi Germany. Sensing the war is coming to an end, Hitler commits suicide in an underground bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Just over 1 week later, Nazi Germany falls, surrendering unconditionally in the West on May 7th and in the East on May 9th, leaving its allies in Japan to fend for themselves. And Japan did just that. For another couple months, the Japanese fought tooth and nail in the Pacific, with major battles occurring throughout that time period. The Battle of Okinawa, which ended June 21st, 1945, saw over 240,000 deaths on all sides alone. As the United States and its allies took over island after island, the losses mounted. It was looking like the only thing that would force Japan to surrender would be a full-scale invasion of the 4 main Japanese islands. But then everything changed. I think you can tell where this is going. On July 16th, 1945, the world changed forever when the first nuclear bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. Codenamed Trinity, the bomb detonated with a yield of 25 kilotons of TNT. Despite debate among scientists and certain government officials, many knew that the United States now had what it needed to end World War II. So they did just that. As previously mentioned, on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, which was home to around 350,000 people. In less than a second, the fireball from the blast grew to 900 feet in diameter. The bomb produced a literal firestorm that incinerated everything within 4.4 miles of the detonation point. The damage was nothing short of catastrophic. Then the US decided to do it again 3 days later. On August 9th, a second bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The goal was to guarantee Japan's unconditional surrender and also to send a message to the Soviet Union. We'll get to that in a bit. Regardless of how you feel about the use of atomic weapons, the US succeeded in its first goal. 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, and on August 15th, 1945, World War II officially came to a close. As I've previously mentioned, the debate around the use of atomic weaponry by the United States is constant. Why did a second bomb have to be dropped? Why did any bombs have to be dropped at all? Weren't there other ways to bring World War II to an end? It's possible. In fact, alternative plans to the use of atomic weaponry were even drawn up. It's time we talk about Operation Downfall. Operation Downfall was the United States' answer to the question of how they could end the war without using nuclear bombs. The plan was fairly simple in theory. Operation Downfall would include 2 sub-operations, if you will, with the goal of taking down Japan and guaranteeing its surrender. Operation Olympic would begin in November of 1945 as an invasion of the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, while Operation Cornet would follow in March of 1946 as an invasion of the main island Honshu. Both of these are pretty damn dense, so let's first break down Operation Olympic. Invading Kyushu would have been no small feat. The Allied naval armada, that is, the total number of ships being used by Allied forces would have been the largest ever assembled. Oh, what's that? You think it's an exaggeration? It's not. The Armada would have included 42 aircraft carriers, over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts, and 24 battleships. Those are insane numbers, and it's only part of the invasion plan. In terms of air forces, it was largely expected to be tactical, targeting Japanese airfields and common areas of transport on both Kyushu and southern Honshu. However, Allied bombing runs were expected to continue throughout Japan as the invasion took place. Finally, let's get to the land forces of Olympic. With the recently secured island of Okinawa as a staging point, nearly 600,000 American soldiers were to invade the island via 35 different landing beaches, all of which were named for cars for some reason. Before they even reached the island of Kyushu though, a few surrounding islands had to be taken first as a part of Operation Olympic. These islands included, and I'm going to butcher these names, Tanegashima, Yakushima, and the Koshikijima Islands. If you cannot tell by now I don't speak Japanese, please don't hold that against me. I'm sorry, I'm doing my best. Once these islands were taken, the 600,000 soldiers would begin their invasion of Kyushu. It was expected that many Japanese soldiers, including kamikaze pilots, would be defending the island, but that American and Allied troops would outnumber them by about 3 to 1. Interestingly enough, Operation Olympic only called for the southern third of Kyushu to be taken, as shown by the dotted line on this map that I ripped straight from Google Images. Allied forces didn't want to take the whole island, they just wanted to use it as a staging point. Oh, what's that? You're wondering what it was a staging point for? Oh my god, that's perfect. Let me introduce Operation Cornet. That was the most garbage transition I've ever done. Did you think Operation Olympic was a doozy? Then I have news for you. Operation Cornet would have been horrifically insane. Cornet was tentatively scheduled to begin on March 1st, 1946. That's right, the war is stretching into 1946 in this alternate timeline. When it comes to numbers, Cornet would have included up to 45 US divisions for both the initial landing on Honshu and the follow-up push to Tokyo. For comparison, you know that day that everyone talks about, D-Day, the most infamous day in World War II? The operation that D-Day was a part of, Operation Overlord, deployed 22 US divisions. Seriously, just think about it. Both Operation Olympic and Operation Cornet would have been on par with D-Day in scale, if not even bigger. Only 5 US infantry divisions landed on beaches on D-Day, and that was nearly 73,000 soldiers. Operation Cornet would have had anywhere between 12 to 20 US infantry divisions. But let's get back to the battle plans. As I've sort of mentioned, Operation Cornet would have followed the same general plan as Operation Olympic, just on an even larger scale. 2 entire armies, the 1st and the 8th, were to take on the assault against Japan's heartland. Their immediate mission was to occupy the Tokyo-Yokohama area and remove all opposition. Before that all happened though, Japan was to be hit by heavy blows via Allied air and naval attacks. Air attacks specifically were to be constant and would increase in intensity as the landing gate approached. The Allies were not holding back. The initial landings on Honshu were to be conducted by 10 reinforced infantry divisions, 3 marine divisions, and 2 armored divisions. On their way to Honshu, these divisions would be protected by ships and planes from the Pacific Fleet, as well as land-based aircraft launched from islands around the Pacific. 30 days after the initial assault, troops in the area were to be reinforced by 3 additional divisions. 5 days after that, more reinforcements would arrive via air. These divisions would then be responsible for seizing the rest of Tokyo and Yokohama, as well as the entire Kanto Plain. There's a lot more that would be going on in numerous battle theaters around Asia at this point, but the entire goal of this attack would be to beat Japan down until the empire finally gave in. As you've probably guessed by now, it would be an extremely difficult task. To make matters even worse though, Japan's defensive strategy was to fight to its very last breath. As 1945 marched on, the Japanese were initially concerned about an invasion coming in the summer of that year. However, with how long the Battle of Okinawa stretched on for, they eventually knew that American and Allied forces wouldn't be able to recover quickly enough, and began to plan for an Allied invasion of the islands coming later in 1945. While by this point Japan had no real shot of winning the war outright, they hoped that with their plans they could come to some sort of armistice or peace deal with the Allies if Allied leaders saw the invasion to be too difficult. Operation Ketsugo was Japan's plan to make that happen. The operation called for every single member of the Japanese population to resist the Allied invasion. Japan even started a propaganda campaign to make this happen, which called for, quote, the glorious death of 100 million. Oh, that campaign also claimed that it was, quote, glorious to die for the Holy Emperor of Japan, and that every Japanese man, woman, and child should die for the Emperor when the Allies arrive. So that's cheery. And this was not just propaganda. In March of 1945, the cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso passed a law establishing the creation of unarmed civil defense units known as Volunteer Corps. The next month, that same cabinet reformed the Volunteer Corps Corps into civilian militia. Then in June, the cabinet passed a special conscription law and named the militia units Volunteer Fighting Corps. The Volunteer Fighting Corps would have only been used had Allied units come close to landing on Japan, which was basically a guarantee. Had that happened, governors of prefectures in Japan, prefectures are kind of like states, would have been able to draft male civilians between the ages of 15 and 60 and unmarried female civilians between the ages of 17 and 40. Commanders of the Volunteer Fighting Corps were appointed from retired military members and civilians who had already had weapons experience. It's important to note that the Volunteer Fighting Corps were never meant to be a first line of defense for Japan. Instead, they were just meant to make the Allied invasion even more difficult than it already would have been. By the end of June 1945, some 28 million people living in Japan were considered combat capable. Yet by the time the war had ended, only 2 million of them had been recruited. An Allied land invasion of Japan would have seen many more of these people recruited into the Volunteer Fighting Corps. The invasion of Japan would have been a battle of attrition, with both sides suffering incredible losses. Estimates from the War Department suggest that the entirety of Operation Downfall would have led to anywhere between 1.7 to 4 million US casualties. That's injuries and deaths. And somewhere between 400,000 to 800,000 US servicemen dead. For reference, 2,501 Americans were killed on D-Day. I'm not trying to compare, I'm not trying to take away from what D-Day was, but think about those numbers for a second. It's absurd. One of the most terrifying facts I can share with you is that during World War II, the United States minted over 1.5 million Purple Heart medals, which is an award given to those who were wounded and killed in battle. Most of these medals were minted in preparation for an invasion of Japan. After the bombs were dropped and World War II ended, the US Purple Heart Reserve sat at about 495,000. The United States is still giving out Purple Hearts from that same reserve to this day. And I haven't even addressed the losses on the Japanese side yet, which would have been far greater. Those same War Department estimates I mentioned earlier place the number of Japanese dead between 5 and 10 million people. I want you to sit with that number for a minute. Had this land invasion happened, the entire way we look at World War II today would have been changed. History as we know it would have been altered forever. Let's now get into a more hypothetical way of thinking and examine that alternate world, starting with how Japan would be changed. Before we get into this section of the video, I just want to preface that a lot of this will be based on my own personal opinion, and my personal opinion will be based on what I've read and learned. Basically, we're learning from each other. Isn't it so cute? Isn't it so fun? Isn't it so quirky? Oh my god. Anyways, there are two ways Japan would have been changed forever. In scenario 1, they still lose the war and surrender unconditionally. In scenario 2, they win the battle of attrition, fend off Operation Downfall, and come to some sort of armistice with Allied forces. For simplicity, we'll start with scenario 1. If Japan still surrendered after Operation Downfall, it's possible that not much would look too different today. However, the rebuild for Japan might have actually taken much longer than it did after the atomic bombings. Additionally, the country's views on World War II would have been very different. Think about it, we know the estimated death toll, and all that land invasion likely would have resulted in more infrastructure damage than 2 atomic bombings on 2 cities. It's crazy to think, but here are some photos of cities that were invaded and not atomically bombed. On the right is Berlin as it was invaded by the Allies, on the left is Warsaw after the Nazis invaded. Both cities took on tremendous damage, neither were hit by nuclear weapons. It's likely that damage like this would have been seen throughout Japan had an Allied land invasion taken place, regardless of whether Japan fought off the invasion or not. But let's move on from that. Obviously, no public memorials for the bombings would exist because, well, there were no bombings. If you haven't figured it out by now that that's what we're talking about, I really needed to keep up, okay? There likely would have been far more memorials scattered around the country, specifically on the islands of Kyushu and Honshu, as that's where the Allied invasions would have occurred. Battlefields would be historical sites, and since a lot of those who died during the invasion were civilians, monuments exist for them specifically. Speaking of civilians, Japan's population in this alternate timeline likely would have taken a hit. As of 2021, Japan's population sat at about 126 million people. However, in 1945, its population was around 71 million. If you take away 5 to 10 million people from that total, population growth likely would have been stunted. I'm not a math guy, so I don't know how much the growth rate would have differed, but I do know it would have differed by some amount. The way they teach the war in Japan today is fascinating and pretty balanced, but does lack slightly. Japanese students are taught about what Japan did in other countries during World War II and certain atrocities they committed, but the details of these atrocities are sometimes left out. Students are also taught about the nuclear bombings and the challenges faced by Japan after the bombs were dropped. Since no bombs were dropped, students in Japan don't get taught about these hardships. Instead, it's possible they'd be taught about how Japan fought hard but lost, and how while they committed atrocities in East Asia, they were the victims of an American invasion as well. Those teachings could reflect a larger anti-American sentiment among the Japanese population too. While Japan might still realize that it's in their best interest to ally with the United States, like they did after the bombs were dropped in our timeline, the mass destruction and huge loss of life from an Allied invasion may leave more people with a negative view of America. Currently, Japan is one of the most pro-American countries in the world, with 67% of Japanese people saying they have a favorable view of the United States as of a 2018 survey. If a full-scale land invasion took place, both Kyushu and Honshu were left in shambles and Japan had to fully surrender, much of the population might not forgive as quickly. With that in mind, let's now get to how things may look today in Japan if they successfully fought off an Allied invasion. as I've already said, fending off an Allied invasion and reaching some sort of armistice would have been Japan's main goal. The country would have tried to achieve this through Operation Ketsugo. It would not have been pretty. There is absolutely no way that Japan could have fought off an invasion of Allied troops without sustaining mass casualties. The government's plan was basically to throw armed civilians at the Allies to the point where Allied countries saw the invasion as too difficult. Let's say Ketsugo succeeds and the Allies give up. An armistice is drawn up that allows Japan to keep certain territories in the Pacific that have not yet been taken back by the Allies. More importantly, there is no Allied occupation of Japan, and Japan's government would look far different today. After the bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered, the island country was under Allied military occupation from 1945 to 1952. US General Douglas MacArthur took up the position of Supreme Leader of the Allied Powers, a fancy term for basically saying he was in charge of instilling a Western-style democracy. Style of government is likely one of the biggest ways Japan would differ today had they fended off an Allied invasion. Before and during World War II, Japan was a constitutional monarchy, but the country operated more as an oligarchy, meaning that a few people made key decisions in government rather than just one. Japan was also still an empire at this time, and they had an emperor, who I've already mentioned. Contrary to popular belief, Emperor Hirohito was largely responsible for the war effort, and he presided over Japan's invasion of China and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Had Japan fought off the Allied invasion, this style of government may not have been done away with. Instead of a democracy, it's possible that Japan would still have some type of aristocracy. Japan still has an emperor today. He's the last head of state in the world to hold the title of emperor, but he's largely powerless and only performs functions that are ceremonial in nature. A successful defense from invasion means he may still have far more power today. Are there other things that could have happened that would have taken away power from Japan's emperor? Yes, of course. Altering history in any sense creates a whole bunch of chaos. But a successful Japanese defense likely means no democracy for Japan after World War II, which has a whole host of other complications, especially for their enemies across the Pacific. It's no secret that World War II is what helped the United States become the global superpower it is today. Jobs created by the war effort helped pull the country out of its Great Depression, and the victory over Nazi Germany and Japan helped spur the golden age of capitalism in the 1950s. Following the nuclear bombings and unconditional surrender of Japan, America largely became the world's unquestioned economic, political, and military superpower. Had Japan come out of an attempted invasion with an armistice, the United States would have failed at its one main goal, and Japan could have remained as a global threat after the fact. Sure, Japan would have been hindered a bit because of its need to rebuild and its loss of population, and the world still would have hated them for all their atrocities, but their government would have remained. While we're on the topic of population loss, those 400,000 to 800,000 US soldier deaths I mentioned earlier would change the way America views World War II forever, especially if the invasion failed. D-Day would not be the day that most people recall from the war. Instead, the failed invasion of Japan would be at the top of everyone's minds. The collective American psyche surrounding World War II would be completely altered. But anyways, back to the golden age of capitalism. This might still have happened, but it's difficult to ultimately say. In the 1950s, the golden age of capitalism came about through tremendous economic growth. A combination of low taxes, balanced budgets, and public spending led to economic prosperity. An extended war effort probably would have pushed the timing of this golden age back a bit. However, increased jobs for the American public could have balanced that out. I'm not an economic expert, so I can't give a definitive answer on this one, but just know the timing of America's golden age could have been impacted regardless of the end result of the invasion. Outside of America's economy, the American public would have faced other impacts after a failed invasion as well. War memorials, remembrance days, you get the idea. Hang on one sec, it's actually getting pretty cold in here. I need to go turn off my AC. That was a joke about the Cold War. Do you get it? Because AC makes things cold. It's cold. Never mind. You might be wondering by now, had the United States not dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, would the Cold War have ever happened? Unless we're talking about a timeline in which the bomb was never built and nobody ever knew about the science behind it, the answer is still yes, though things would probably look way different. If the invasion went well and the Allies took over, the Cold War likely would have been similar to how it was in our timeline, a standoff between America and the Soviet Union. The Cold War is an extremely complex historical event, one that I could probably make an entire video on by itself. But I don't have time to do that right now, so let's just roll with what we've got. Okay, so to recap, in our hypothetical scenario, the Allies, including the Soviets by the way, invade Japan, Japan fends off the invasion, an armistice is signed, and now we're looking at a world that still has nuclear bombs and 2 global superpowers racing to build said bombs. But where does Japan come in? Well, throughout the Cold War, multiple countries were fought over in cold ways as the Soviet Union attempted to spread communism and the US tried to stop that spread. The Korean and Vietnam Wars were both fought ultimately about communism. Japan could have been one of those countries post-World War II. In an unstable environment like that, communism could have taken root and become a far more popular ideology in Japan, prompting the US to reinvade. The Red Scare was a real thing, and so so many Americans in the 1950s were terrified of communism, and this sentiment lasted until the Soviet Union fell in 1991. Even today, certain government officials think communism is coming for them for some reason. Anyways, back to the Cold War. An arms race still would have happened, and honestly, maybe it's possible that both countries would have been more eager to pull the trigger since they weren't entirely sure what effect it would have on a specific target. I doubt that would happen, but you never really know. That's the whole point of this channel. Did you know that? I really hope you figured it out by now. To sum it up, a Cold War in this timeline focuses far more on Japan than it would have otherwise. As Japan rebuilds, communism spreads, which draws America's attention back to the island nation. The Soviet Union sees this attention and tries to fund communist entities in Japan. A few chess moves later, and boom, we've got a proxy war on our hands. And this proxy war would change history forever. That was a ton of history, specifically alternate history, that I just covered, and I hope you found it at least a little bit interesting. There's obviously a lot that I wasn't able to cover, so I would love to hear your thoughts in those comments down below about what I may have missed and how I can improve my videos in the future. This is far and away the biggest project I've ever put together for my YouTube channel, and I'm beyond proud of it. If you enjoyed, please feel free to like and subscribe, it would mean the world. Feel free to follow me on TikTok and Instagram as well. I'll link those in the description. I do shorter, way lighter content over there. All of my sources for this video are down in the description as well. If you've made it this far, thank you again for watching. For now, I'll see you later.